They called him a genius, the man who changed how we see art forever, the man who tore beauty apart and built it again from broken shapes. But what if the genius wasn't always in control of his own mind? What if the paintings that redefined the entire language of art were born not from clarity, but from intoxication? Pablo Picasso, painter, sculptor, rebel, provocateur, the name alone stands for genius. Yet behind the myth, behind the fame, behind the legend, was a man who lived under the haze of opium and absinthe. So the question is, when Picasso painted, who was really holding the brush? Was it the man or the mind under influence? If the artist creates his masterpiece in an altered state, is it still him creating, or is it the drug painting through him? And if that's true, if the vision only comes when the mind is not his own, then what does that make him? A fraud, or simply a genius trapped inside a world that only intoxication could reveal? Now, before we dive into the life of Picasso, kindly give this video a like and subscribe to support the channel. Before Cubism, before fame, before the smoke of opium ever touched his lungs, Pablo Picasso was already painting like a master. He was born in Málaga, Spain, on October 25, 1881, a small coastal town filled with the sounds of church bells, the smell of the sea, and the sight of bullfights in the afternoon sun. His father, Don José Ruiz Blasco, was an art teacher and painter, a man who believed in discipline, structure, and tradition. He spent his days teaching students how to draw birds and still life objects, how to paint what the eye could see. But his son Pablo was different. He didn't just copy what he saw, he felt things before he understood them. He once said his first word wasn't mama or papa, it was piz, short for lapis, meaning pencil. And from that moment it was as if his whole life would be written in lines and colors. At 7 years old, his father began to train him seriously. He would make Pablo copy classical sketches and study anatomy, forcing him to master proportion and precision. Most children would have resisted such rigid lessons, but not Picasso. He absorbed everything, every stroke, every rule, every principle of form and shadow. And then before long, he began breaking those rules one by one. By the age of 9, he had completed his first proper painting, Le Picador, a bullfighter on horseback surrounded by the energy of the arena. Even as a child, he painted movement, not just moments. His father was astonished. This was no child's play. The colors were deliberate, the energy real. There was a confidence in his brushwork that belonged to someone much older. Then came the moment that changed everything. When Picasso was 13, his father realized he had nothing left to teach him. The story goes that Don José watched his son finishing a painting one evening, and when he saw the boy's control of the brush, the natural ease in his gestures, he silently handed Pablo his own palette and brushes and vowed never to paint again. It wasn't out of defeat, it was out of awe. He had witnessed something greater than skill. He had seen raw genius in its earliest form. At 15, Picasso completed First Communion, a large, ambitious oil painting depicting his sister kneeling at the altar. The realism was impeccable. The folds of the fabric, the shimmer of candlelight, the spiritual stillness captured with a maturity far beyond his years. It was the kind of work that should have belonged to an experienced master, not a teenage boy from southern Spain. And then came Science and Charity. A doctor, a nun, and a frail woman lying in bed. It wasn't just a painting, it was empathy made visible. The brushstrokes were calm and confident, each detail deliberate. The anatomy was perfect, the composition balanced, the emotion restrained yet deeply human. The art world couldn't believe a 16-year-old could paint like that. They called him a prodigy. They said Spain had found its new Velázquez. But here's where the story turns. Because perfection, when achieved too early, becomes a kind of burden. When you master everything before the world even expects you to, you begin to crave something else, something you can't control. For Picasso, mastery became a prison. He could already paint anything he wanted. The problem was, he no longer wanted to paint what he could see. He began searching for something deeper, a language that could describe emotion, distortion, confusion, and the chaos of being alive. He was tired of beauty being predictable. He wanted to break it apart. And so began his journey from prodigy to pioneer, from precision to experimentation, from technique to transformation. He didn't need drugs to prove his gift. He didn't need fame to validate it. He didn't even need the world to understand him. Because deep down, Picasso knew that his talent was both a blessing and a burden, a gift that demanded more than reality could give. So maybe he didn't turn to opium for inspiration. Maybe he turned to it for escape. Escape from control, escape from perfection, escape from the unbearable ease of being great. Because sometimes the greatest struggle for a genius isn't learning how to create, it's learning how to be ordinary. At the turn of the 20th century, Paris was not just a city, it was an idea, a living, breathing organism where art, poetry, and rebellion collided in the streets. The cafes were filled with dreamers, and the air smelled of turpentine, tobacco, and absinthe. And into this world walked a young Spanish artist named Pablo Picasso, only 19 years old, carrying nothing but talent, ambition, and hunger. It was 1900. Picasso had just arrived for the Exposition Universelle, the grand world fair that celebrated invention and art. But what caught his attention wasn't the glittering displays or the official exhibitions. It was the underground life of Montmartre, a hilltop neighborhood alive with chaos and creativity. This was where he met the outsiders, poets, painters, anarchists, and dreamers, people who lived for art and often died for it. Picasso rented a small studio in the famous Bateau Lavoir, a crumbling building that became a symbol of the Bohemian spirit. The walls were damp, the winters were freezing, and there was barely enough money for food. But there was something electric in the air. Nights were filled with laughter, smoke, and endless arguments about art and existence. The conversation spilled over into dawn, when inspiration and intoxication were impossible to separate. Absinthe was the drink of choice. They called it the green fairy. Artists and poets believed it opened the doors of perception, that it helped them see beyond the limits of the ordinary world. And then there was opium, a heavier, slower escape, a way to step outside of reality completely, to dissolve the borders between the visible and the invisible. In those circles, opium wasn't just a vice. It was a philosophy, a ritual. Painters like Toulouse-Lautrec, Modigliani, and poets like Baudelaire all flirted with its effects. They saw it as a key to unlock new visions, to disconnect from reason and reconnect with instinct. And soon, Picasso, the restless genius from Spain, found himself drawn into this same current. He had already mastered the discipline of form. Now he wanted to destroy it, to feel something raw, something unfiltered. Paris gave him permission to do that. Here, the idea of being sober, rational, and traditional was almost shameful. Real artists were supposed to suffer, to lose control, to bleed for their vision. Picasso painted late into the night, his studio thick with the smell of smoke, paint, and opium. He worked fast, almost feverishly, as if he were chasing something just beyond his reach. He painted faces that weren't quite human, bodies that bent in impossible ways, eyes that stared in different directions, and he began to see not what was in front of him, but what was inside him. It was during this period that Picasso entered what's now called his blue period, paintings filled with melancholy, loneliness, and quiet despair. The figures were elongated, their faces pale and haunted. He was surrounded by poverty, death, and addiction, and those emotions seeped into his art. He once said, "I paint the way some people write their autobiography." And during those nights, that autobiography was written in shades of blue and smoke. The opium didn't give him skill, he already had that. But it changed his perception of reality. It blurred the edges of things, turned form into emotion, and allowed him to translate sensations that sober eyes could never see. It wasn't escape from art, it was a way into it, a way to see the world as a collection of feelings instead of facts. In the cafes of Montparnasse and the back rooms of Montmartre, Picasso argued about color with poets and debated truth with drunk philosophers. He saw art not as imitation, but as invention, a kind of visual music where the notes came from the subconscious. And when you think about it, the journey from the precise realism of Science and Charity to the fragmented revolution of Les Demoiselles d'Avignon makes more sense when you remember what fueled those nights. Because Paris in those days wasn't about technique, it was about transcendence. To be an artist was to go beyond the mind, to destroy the boundaries between the self and the world. And sometimes opium was the bridge. Picasso didn't just want to paint what he saw, he wanted to paint what he felt. And sometimes feeling required distortion. Opium wasn't an escape from art. It was a key to unlock a vision that felt larger than life itself. So when we look at his early Paris years, we don't just see the birth of Cubism or the struggle of a young painter. We see a man experimenting not just with style, but with perception itself. We see an artist walking the thin line between genius and oblivion, risking his sanity in pursuit of a new way of seeing. After the haze and rebellion of Paris came a quieter, darker chapter in Picasso's story, one painted almost entirely in blue. Between 1901 and 1904, Picasso fell into what history now calls the blue period. But to him, it wasn't a period, it was a collapse. The death of his closest friend, Carlos Casagemas, who shot himself over a failed love affair, shattered Picasso's world. He was only 19, standing face to face with grief for the first time. And instead of words, he spoke through paint. Everything he created turned cold, lonely, and filled with sorrow. Look at the old guitarist, thin, fragile, almost ghostly. His figures weren't people anymore, they were shadows of sadness. Street beggars, blind men, and mothers holding dying children, all frozen in blue. The world looked like it had drowned in melancholy, and Picasso painted what drowning felt like. Some say he painted through tears, others say through smoke, the smoke of Parisian opium dens that never truly cleared. Maybe it was both, because grief and addiction often dance together, one feeding the other, each promising a kind of escape. But even in the darkness, his genius never disappeared, it just changed color. And then, suddenly, the blue began to fade. Around 1904, Picasso moved to Montmartre again, living at Le Bateau Lavoie, a rickety artist's building filled with chaos, laughter, and constant conversation. He fell in love with Fernande Olivier, and the world began to warm up again. This was the start of the Rose period. The blues softened into pinks and oranges. The people in his paintings began to smile, even if faintly. He painted acrobats, circus performers, and lovers, fragile people, but beautiful in their fragility. In Family of Saltimbanques, the clowns look lonely, but there's tenderness in their stillness, a quiet dignity in their sadness. It's as if Picasso was painting his own emotional recovery, a fragile happiness that could vanish at any moment. But even as he returned to light, something new was stirring inside him, something restless. The artist who had mastered classical realism, who had bent emotion into color, was now ready to shatter vision itself, and that's where Cubism was born. It started in 1907 when Picasso painted Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, 5 distorted female figures, part African mask, part fractured geometry, all revolutionary. When his friends first saw it, they were horrified. It was too strange, too violent, too unlike anything seen before. But Picasso wasn't trying to please anyone anymore. He wasn't even trying to paint beauty. He was trying to paint truth, not as we see it, but as we experience it. In Les Demoiselles, you can see the mind of a man breaking vision into pieces, the way a prism breaks light. The eyes look in 2 directions at once. The bodies twist, flatten, and fold over each other. It's not a painting of women. It's a painting of perception. And behind it all, there was something else. Nights of intoxication, conversations with poets and philosophers, the quiet hum of absinthe glasses, the occasional pipe of opium burning in the background. Picasso's mind began to fracture, the same way his paintings did. He wasn't just changing art, he was changing reality. Was it the drug, the grief, the genius, or some mysterious fusion of all 3? No one can say for sure. But it's clear that Picasso didn't just see differently. He felt differently. He lived on the edge of clarity and chaos, where imagination blurs with intoxication. And perhaps that's the real question. When a mind like Picasso's bends the rules of sight, when emotion and vision dissolve into one another, is that madness? Or is that what true genius looks like? Because sometimes in art, madness and brilliance are 2 faces of the same portrait, and Picasso, he painted both. So now we arrive at the real question, the one that has been hiding beneath every brushstroke, every rumor, every cloud of smoke in Picasso's story. When Picasso painted under the influence, was it still Picasso painting, or was it something or someone else taking over? The artist's hand may hold the brush, but what about the mind that guides it? If that mind is altered, twisted, or expanded by a substance, where does authorship truly live? Think about it. When a poet writes while drunk, are the words his or the liquor's? When a musician creates under LSD, do we praise the melody or the molecule? And when Picasso, perhaps under opium's spell, shattered reality into fragments of Cubism, do we call that addiction or innovation? This is not a moral question, it's a philosophical one. Because the boundary between influence and inspiration has always been thin. For centuries, artists have sought ways to break free from ordinary perception, to escape the prison of realism, to reach something more raw, more divine. Some use meditation, some use madness, some use drugs. Picasso once said, "Art is a lie that makes us realize truth." Maybe in his own way, opium was another lie, a chemical trick that made truth more visible. But here's the paradox. If drugs helped him see the world differently, then maybe they also helped him create the world differently. Yet if the drugs distorted him, made him see things that weren't real, then who exactly was painting? Was it Picasso, the prodigy from Málaga, or Picasso, the vessel of something larger than himself? Art history loves clean stories, the idea of genius as something pure, untouchable. But real genius is messy. It bleeds, it bends. It often needs something, pain, loss, love, or intoxication, to push it beyond reason. So what if Picasso's genius wasn't a steady flame, but a flickering one that burned brightest only when fanned by chaos? Does that make him less of a genius or more human? Because here's another layer to this mystery. When Picasso wasn't high, when the haze lifted, he still painted, obsessively, relentlessly, day after day. He created over 20,000 works in his lifetime. So the opium didn't make him an artist. It might have just cracked open new doors inside his imagination. Maybe it didn't control him. Maybe it freed him from convention, from logic, from fear. But then again, what if it trapped him? What if the high became the only way to reach the feeling he was chasing? That dangerous illusion that the mind could expand forever without consequence. That's the tragedy of many great artists. They confuse the muse with the medicine. They think the brilliance is in the bottle, the pipe, the powder, when really it was in them all along. Still, you have to wonder, if Picasso had never touched opium, would Cubism ever have existed? Would he still have seen faces as planes and eyes as shapes? Would the 20th century still have been broken open by Les Demoiselles d'Avignon? Maybe not. Maybe yes. Maybe the drug didn't give him vision. Maybe it gave him permission. Permission to unsee the world as it is and paint it as it feels. So who paints when the artist is under influence? Is it the drug, the pain, the genius? Or are they all one and the same, threads woven into the same creative storm? If a drug helps you access a part of your mind you couldn't reach sober, does that make the art less authentic? Or does it make it more, because it's drawn from a deeper, hidden part of the human experience? And if Picasso couldn't always replicate that intensity in sobriety, maybe that's the point. Maybe true genius isn't about control. Maybe it's about surrender, to art, to emotion, to chaos. Because sometimes the masterpiece doesn't come from a clear mind. It comes from a mind brave enough or desperate enough to let go. So when you stand before a Picasso painting, ask yourself, are you looking at what he saw or what he became while seeing? Who really painted it? The man, the madness, or the moment when both became indistinguishable? That's the eternal mystery of Picasso, and maybe of all great art. Whether his hand was guided by his mind or by the fog of opium, one truth remains. Pablo Picasso changed art forever. He could already paint perfection. He didn't need cubism to prove anything. He didn't need abstraction to earn respect. Yet he walked away from realism, from beauty, from order, and chose to paint perception itself. Even if that perception was blurred, broken, and altered. And that's where the real genius might lie. Because genius isn't always clean or controlled. Sometimes it's chaotic, sometimes it's messy. Sometimes it lives right at the edge between creation and destruction. Picasso didn't fake his art. He risked himself for it. He tore apart everything art used to be and built something new from the ruins. Even if part of that vision came through the haze of opium, the courage to follow it was his alone. Maybe that's what separates a fraud from a genius. A fraud hides behind illusion. A genius uses illusion to reveal truth. Picasso once said, "Every act of creation is first an act of destruction." Perhaps the destruction wasn't just on the canvas. Maybe it was inside him too, the tearing down of reason, the surrender to madness, the willingness to go where the sober mind refuses to go. So was Picasso's art born from addiction or from ambition? Did the drug inspire the vision or merely amplify what was already within him? We can never know for sure, but we can feel it. Every angular face, every distorted body, every fractured form carries that tension between man and mind, control and chaos, clarity and confusion. Maybe Picasso wasn't a fraud. Maybe he was simply human, reaching for the divine through any means possible, searching for that one perfect moment when imagination overtakes reality and art becomes something larger than life. Because in the end, every artist, in one way or another, paints under influence, not always of drugs, but of emotions, obsessions, memories, fears, and dreams. Picasso's influence just happened to come in smoke. He painted the world not as it looked, but as it felt. And in doing so, he gave birth to modern art as we know it. So what do you think? Was Picasso a fraud hiding behind the drug, or a genius who simply painted what his mind allowed him to see? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because maybe the answer says as much about us as it does about him.